Hello. You have found yourself back at the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr Nerida, and today's episode is one I have been wanting to do for a while, and that is sharing 5 of my favourite, would love to add to almost every diet ingredients, and I will share 5 ingredients that I avoid, some of them at all costs. Nutrition to me is like a big fun jigsaw puzzle, and there is no one perfect ingredient. So building great diets relies on finding ingredients that add valuable pieces to the puzzle, while also avoiding the ingredients that are more like a toddler let loose on a 1,000-piece jigsaw. They're definitely going to cause more destruction than anything else. Before we dive in though, I just want to take a quick moment to say a very genuine thank you, because this is our last new episode for the year and I'm feeling very grateful and a bit reflective. Firstly, thank you to you for listening, whether you've had the podcast on while you're feeding up, driving, mucking out, riding, walking the dog, or just trying to figure out what on earth you're meant to be feeding your horse. Thank you for making this show a part of your life and a part of your horse's world. And I have to share this because honestly, it blew me away and gave me the biggest smile. Spotify tells us that you shared this podcast more than 97% of other shows, which to me is wild. It's not something that I ever expected would have happened. I had a colleague say to me last week after he asked me a question about VFA production in a horse's hindgut, "Thanks for sharing your knowledge." And I said back to him, it's really no use me having knowledge unless I share it. And if it can be used to improve the welfare of even one horse, then I'm happy and it's so worth it. So biggest thanks to you for also sharing the information contained in these podcasts. It really is very humbling and truly means a lot. I also want to say a huge thank you to our wonderful David. Thank you, David. I know you're listening to this as you edit this edition of the podcast. And if I'm honest, David makes me sound far more coherent than I am in real life and makes this podcast just sound so professional. And I'm truly grateful to you, David, for all that you contribute. And my friend Orla, thank you for being you, Orla. You bring such heart and fun and a great sense of reality to the podcast, and it is absolutely better for you being a part of it. And I love our time together, and we have so much fun doing our Q&A. So I'm very grateful to you for being willing to be a part of that. To all of our guests this year, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thanks for sharing your expertise, your time, and your stories. Even if they weren't stories you shared, looking at you, Dr. Brian, and your pet rabbit. Seriously, though, you have helped make this podcast scientific yet grounded, and judging by the feedback from people who have been in contact with me about the podcast, also genuinely useful. All right. From me, from our little team, biggest thank you for being here again, for helping us get good science-based horse nutrition information to travel further than it ever could on its own. It is all of our horses that will collectively benefit, and that is what drives us to keep doing what we do. So with all of that said, let's get into today's episode. Like I mentioned briefly already, nutrition is like a giant jigsaw puzzle. And if you speak to nutritionists, and particularly formulating nutritionists like myself, and there's a bunch of us in the world, I got to hang out with quite a few other formulating equine nutritionists at the American Association of Equine Practitioners convention last week. We see and feel in a lot of ways the nutrition of horses, and it's, we have all of these ingredients at our disposal, and we're given a task to either formulate a product, so a bagged ingredient or a supplement, something like that, or we're given a task to formulate a diet for a specific horse. We have all of these ingredients available, and it's a matter of figuring out, using what we know about nutrition, and also using software tools like My Happy Horse or like the FeedXL nutrition calculator, to bring together all of those ingredients in a way that will meet a horse's nutrient requirements. So there is no one perfect ingredient, and you can never ever feed a horse a diet that is based on one or even a couple of ingredients. And in fact, the best diets are always built on the broadest diversity of ingredients possible. There is a whole podcast episode, I think it's number 24, that talks about ingredient diversity in a horse's diet and why it's so important. So I won't go into a lot of detail on that today, but what I do want to talk about is 5 of my favorite ingredients. And it really was hard to pick out my top 5 because I have, if you ask my partner Ryan, I have lots of favorites in life. And when I first met him, he said, I don't do favorites. And I was thinking, how can someone not have favorite things? But I realized it was because he sees a favorite as how it should be, like a single thing that is your favorite. Well, I have favorites, and it's just that I have like 10 or 20 favorites in one category. So, I have favorite breeds of dogs, about 10 of them. Favorite breeds of horses, about 10 of them. I have favorite horses, all 7 of the ones that I own. So I don't do favorites in your classical pick out one thing that's my favorite. So it was really hard for me to pick 5 of my favorite ingredients because there are lots of ingredients that I love. And the reality is there's lots of ingredients. I would never build a diet out of 5 ingredients, but I'm just going to give you the 5 that will fit into most horses' diets and the ones that I do find infinitely useful in so many diets. And I also want to share 5 ingredients that I will avoid, and some of them avoid at all costs because of the damage that they do in a horse's gut. So let's kick off with the 5 best ingredients or 5 of my favorite ingredients. And sitting at the top of that list for me is lucerne or alfalfa. So lucerne and alfalfa are the same thing. It's just that in some parts of the world we call it lucerne, and in other parts of the world we call it alfalfa. So if I use one or the other, just know that they are exactly the same thing. It's just different terminology in different parts of the world. So lucerne to me is, I just love the stuff. And I think partly I love it because I love the smell of it. When you smell freshly cut lucerne or, beautiful lucerne hay, like honestly I just want to stick my nose in it and just keep smelling because it smells so delicious. But when you have a look at the nutrient profile of lucerne, it brings so many important nutrients to a horse's diet, and it brings it to them in a very palatable way. So horses typically love lucerne. So it means that we can bring in the nutrients that it contains in a way that horses also love to consume, because I don't know that I've ever met a horse that doesn't love lucerne. So lucerne is obviously a forage. It is a legume, which means that it will typically be quite high in protein and also quite high in calcium. And those 2 nutrients are 2 that we often go chasing in a horse's diet, and particularly horses that, broodmares are a classic example. Their protein requirements are massive when they're producing milk for their foal, and their calcium requirements are massive when producing milk for their foal. So it brings those 2 nutrients in, but even in working horses' diets or even horses that are not doing very much, sometimes our grass forages and absolutely any grains that you may be feeding, they can be low in calcium. So bringing some lucerne into that diet will bring calcium in, and it will also bring the beautiful protein that lucerne has. So I need to do a whole episode on protein, because protein is such a fascinating nutrient, because protein is not protein. So the protein in lucerne is going to be different to the protein in, say, ryegrass, which will be different to the protein in timothy, which will be different to the protein in Bermuda. Every protein from every different plant source is different because proteins are made up of 20 different amino acids, and those amino acids are put together in strings to form the particular protein that plant or the grain or some sort of seed will contain. So the string or the combination of amino acids in lucerne is very valuable because it tends to be quite high in the essential amino acids. Of the 20 amino acids that all plants contain, or all plant material contains, 10 of them are what we call essential amino acids, and that means that the horse can't make them for themselves, and they're the same 10 essential amino acids for us as humans, so we can't make them either. And they have to be provided in the diet. And lucerne is quite rich in the ones that will run out first in a horse's diet. So we've got lysine, methionine, and threonine, which are known as the most limiting amino acids. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when I get to some of my other favourite ingredients. But lucerne brings in lovely amounts of those essential amino acids to a diet, and amounts that may be a little bit low for horses on grass forage-based diets or on, if they're performance horses, on cereal grain, possibly a little bit low in those diets as well. There's other reasons I love lucerne. It brings fibre variety to a horse's diet. So if you have horses that are on largely grass-based hay or grass-based pastures, the lucerne or alfalfa brings in fibre diversity. And I talk a lot about fibre diversity in various podcasts throughout this season 1 of the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast. But the really brief rundown on that is that the more fibre diversity we can bring into a horse's diet, the more microbiome diversity we create in their hindgut. And the more diverse, and what I mean by that is you'll have more species of bacteria and fungi in a horse's gut. And the more species of those microbes we can get into a horse's hindgut, the more stable that hindgut environment will be. So, if the horse travels to an event and competes, all of that is stressful to a horse's gut. And we know from research that it will cause changes in the microbiome. But if you've got a really diverse population of microbes in your horse's hindgut, they'll wobble for sure, but they're not going to get knocked into dysbiosis, versus a horse that is on a very limited fibre diversity diet and has a much more limited microbiome diversity. They're more likely to be knocked into dysbiosis and then end up with problems like colic. So fibre diversity is incredibly important, and lucerne is one of these ingredients that allows us to bring in a totally different fibre to what you'll find in you say more grassy hays or grassy pastures or grains. So it's beautiful from that perspective. And the last thing I'll mention about lucerne is that with its high protein and high calcium, we know from research that it actually does a really beautiful job of buffering a horse's stomach and potentially reduces the risk of squamous gastric ulceration, which is the ulceration that occurs in the top of a horse's stomach and is caused by the acid from the bottom of the stomach splashing up and literally burning holes through the top of a horse's stomach. So we use alfalfa for things like feeding your horse before you ride, because it's a forage, so the horse has to chew it a lot. They have to produce a lot of saliva, and that saliva will buffer or reduce the acidity of the fluid in the horse's stomach and reduce the risk of ulceration. And it also creates the fibre mat the fibre in the horse's stomach that physically stops the acids from splashing around. But with its nutrient characteristics, it's also a natural buffer itself. So the alfalfa will act to actually buffer or make the fluid in the horse's stomach less acidic and less likely to cause ulceration. There are many, many reasons to add alfalfa to a horse's diet. There is a caution there in that it should never be the only forage that a horse is fed. You can overfeed lucerne, and because it's so high in protein and high in calcium, it'll cause issues. It's not the ingredient itself, it's the amount that you feed and then the impact of that amount on your horse's protein and calcium intake. So when horses are eating a lot of protein and or a lot of calcium, they urinate a lot. And when they urinate a lot, they lose a lot of electrolyte. So if you're feeding a lot of alfalfa and it's also hot and humid and your horse has got very high electrolyte requirements, you do put them at increased risk of tying up, because they'll lose so much electrolyte that their muscles won't be able to work properly. And nearly every year, and particularly where there's an unusually long period of hot and humid weather, I will have a racing stable somewhere in the country that has a lot of horses tying up. And when I go back and look at their diet, generally what I'll find is that lucerne or another legume like clover is being used as the only forage in the horse's diet. So their protein and calcium intakes are really high. So it's one of those ingredients. It's like most things, even in our own nutrition, everything in moderation. So, and this is where we come back to, it's got to be a part of the jigsaw puzzle, but not the whole puzzle. So absolutely having it, and I will put lucerne into every single diet that I can fit it into. But it has to be in there at the correct level, and it's often not very much. So for a racehorse in full work, I typically try and keep the lucerne in their diet to 2 kilos, which is just over 4 pounds. Any more than that, and we start to push the protein too high. It's a very different story for a lactating brood mare. We might be pushing 6 kilograms or almost 9 pounds of alfalfa into their diet, because they have such high protein and calcium requirements, and it's a really nice way to meet those nutrient requirements. And it's also quite high in energy too, which for performance horses and lactating brood mares makes it very valuable from that perspective as well. My next ingredient on the favourites list is a mixed grassy hay or mixed grassy pasture. So the most boring ingredient we can talk about because it is, we almost take for granted sometimes the forage base of a horse's diet. So, the forage that makes up the bulk of a horse's diet. So for all of my horses, they're all out grazing all of the time, and the amount of feed I actually feed them is quite small. Most of them are on less than half a kilogram of balancer pellet a day, and then everything else they get fed is either some alfalfa and teff hay in the form of cubes. So the grassy pasture that I have makes up a vast majority of their diet, but it's such an important and such a valuable part of their diet because it's a really diverse grassy pasture. And it really comes back to what I was talking about before with the fibre diversity in your horse's diet, creating microbiome diversity. And that microbiome diversity is so important. So I've mentioned already that if you've got a diverse microbiome, it's less likely to get knocked out of balance and fall into dysbiosis and put your horse at increased risk of diseases like colic. But it's also important from the perspective that if you've got a really diverse microbiome, you're more likely to have the microbes in there that are doing the jobs like supporting your horse's immune function and helping to maintain the mucousy lining on the horse's gut wall so that the gut wall stays very healthy. They produce B vitamins and vitamins like vitamin K. So your horse is actually quite heavily reliant on their microbes in their gut to be producing vitamins for them. And they also produce a lot of neurotransmitters and hormones that are super important in your horse's gut-brain axis communication. So a lot of what you see in your horse's behaviour is being driven by who they have living in their gut. And the more diverse we can make this grassy portion of their diet, the more likely you are to have all of the important species of microbes living in a horse's hindgut to enable them to, support their horse in the way that they need to. Because if you go back and listen to episode 1 of this podcast, where I talk about feeding your horse like a horse, we have to honour their 55 million years of evolution when we look at their nutrition. They have such an ancient gut. And these diverse grassy forages, be it hay or pasture, or if you can't find one diverse grassy hay, then, bringing in multiple different hays into your horse's diet to create diversity in their diet is so important because their whole being, everything, all of their physiology is designed around them being free-roaming animals and being able to go and select a really diverse range of plant species to eat over the full course of a 12-month period throughout all of the different seasons that they experience in the wild. So the more we can recreate that for our domesticated horses, the healthier they will be because their gut will be in a much more natural state. So, as humans, we've been in their life such a tiny portion of time. So 0.01% of the time horses have been in earth, we've been involved in their lives. So we have to adapt our feeding programs to what their gut is expecting and has developed over all that time to need. We just have to. There is no way to keep horses healthy unless we feed them the way their gut is designed to be fed. And a massive part of that is these mixed grassy forages. So if there's one thing you focus on for the next 12 months with feeding your horse, it is bring in more diversity in the forage portion of your horse's diet. Go and find different hays and haylages and anything you can find that's a little bit different and bring that into your horse's diet to try and create that fibre diversity. Okay, next on my list, and apologies to anyone who's not in Australia or New Zealand for this one, but honestly, you all in the rest of the world should start to grow this ingredient, and that's lupins. So the sweet lupins that we have in Australia, if you go and Google lupins, you'll probably freak out thinking that I'm feeding horses toxic things, but there's different types of lupins, but the sweet lupins that we use here for in Australia in horse diets are just the most incredible ingredient. And so they contain virtually no starch, and I mean virtually no starch. Like there's less than 2% starch. They're very high in digestible fibre. They've got beautiful protein. They've got a lovely amount of oil in them. If you take the hull and just use the hull, it's a little bit like beet pulp or soybean hulls. But unlike soybean hulls, it doesn't have any risk of any anti-nutritional factors. They don't rely on heat processing to be safe. So they're an incredible ingredient. They're very useful for horses that need low sugar, low starch diets. So for things like laminitic ponies or horses with PPID and insulin dysregulation, it means that we can bring some really high quality protein and beautiful fibres and oils into their diet without bringing in too much starch or water soluble carbohydrate. So they're infinitely useful. I think for me, I love, and I'll talk about soybean in a minute, but I love soybean as a protein source. But something that I was taught to do very early on in my career as a horse nutritionist was to combine protein sources because of this quirk of protein, and protein being made up of the 20 different amino acids. When you combine different sources of protein, you're getting different combinations of amino acids. So I love to bring lupins in as a source of protein into horses' diets because they bring in a slightly different amino acid profile to the faba beans that we often use, or peas or soybean. So they're a gorgeous ingredient. They don't have any anti-nutritional factors when you use the correct lupin. And they don't actually need heat processing. So we do buy and I use either micronized or extruded lupins. But the only reason we process lupins is because they are so hard as a seed that they'll actually break teeth. So you can't feed lupins to horses without processing them in some way, and you can just soak them. So if you go out and buy whole lupins, you can actually soak them. They take a while to soak to be soft enough for a horse to chew. But unlike things like cereal grains or soybean that need heat processing to actually be safe to feed to a horse, lupins don't need heat as such to be safe. They don't need processing to be safe. They just need to be have their seed coat broken and squashed a little bit or soaked so they're nice and safe so that horses can chew them, because they're so hard. And if you go and find some lupins and try to chew on one, you don't break your teeth. But if you try to chew on one, you'll see what I mean. They're incredibly hard to chew. So do soak them or buy crushed lupins or buy extruded or micronized lupins, because the processing just makes them chewable. That's it. And it's also a reason why I do love them, because they don't, other than not being able to be chewed, then there's no unsafe state for them. So it's not like corn, which I'll talk about soon, where if you feed it raw and unprocessed, it's definitely unsafe to feed to a horse. So lupins don't have that unsafe state, other than they're so hard they'd probably break teeth if you try to feed them whole. Okay, moving on to 5 of the best. Number 4, I've got oats here. Oats are obviously a cereal grain, and they have the cereal grain characteristic that they contain a fair amount of starch. But oats are a little bit different to other cereal grains like corn or maize and barley and rice, other cereal grains like that, because compared to the other cereal grains, they're reasonably low in starch. So where corn might be, upwards of 70% starch and barley would typically be more than 60% starch, oats usually contain somewhere between 30 and 45% starch, depending. It varies quite a lot depending on the oat grain that you have. They're lower in starch than the other cereal grains, which immediately makes them safer to feed to horses. The reason I have a cereal grain on my favourites list, so some of you might be going, why would you even have a cereal grain on your favourites list? But there are horses that I cannot get them to perform unless we have some cereal grain in their diet. Thoroughbred racehorses are one such type of horse. They need some starch in their diet to allow them to replenish their muscle glycogen fast enough to be able to back up, say, from a gallop to then go and race, or to back up from one race to the next race. I've tried many times over the years for various reasons to get horses to race on grain-free diets, and I just can't. I can get them to win one race, and then after that, they just can't back up. So I do love to have cereal grains that are safe to feed, and oats is a lovely one because it, like I just said, it's a lot lower in starch, so it does make it just inherently safer to feed because it's lower in starch than the other cereal grains. But the other thing about that starch is if you think about the starch, so if you grab an oat or a barley or a corn and break it open, you'll see the white stuff in the middle of the grain, and that's the starch. So you can see the starch. If anyone bakes, which I'm sure nearly all of you do, or use white flour typically, just your normal standard white flour, is just starch out of wheat grain. That's all it is. So it's white, and you can see it in the middle of the grains. But if you look at that starch through a very powerful microscope, what you will see is these tiny little white balls that look almost like golf balls. And that's how the starch is contained natively in a cereal grain. So starch is just a string of glucose all joined together. So many glucoses all joined together, but it's not just hanging around in the middle of a starch grain as a string of glucose molecules. It's rolled up and bundled up really, really tightly into what looks like a golf ball. Now, in a grain like corn, which we will talk about soon, it's bundled up so tightly that when your horse's enzymes, which are the little pairs of scissors in the small intestine that come along and digest food for them, when those enzymes get to one of these golf balls of starch, it's bundled up so tightly that the enzymes can't actually cut it apart because they physically can't unbundle that starch granule that's bundled up too tightly. But the interesting thing about oats is when I was doing my PhD research, we were doing lots of in vitro, so in glass experiments with cereal grains to look at how much starch can we get digested using the enzymes that we would normally find in a horse's small intestine in 15 minutes. So what we'd do is we'd take a standardized and tiny little bit of grain in a test tube, and then we would add the enzymes amylase and amyloglucosidase to the test tube, and we'd have it all buffered like the small intestine is, and it would sit at body temperature with a little stirrer in the bottom so the enzymes had the opportunity to come into contact with the starch. And then after 15 minutes, we would stop the enzyme digestion process, and then we would look at how much starch. So we knew exactly how much starch was in each test tube. And we would then have a look at, well, how much of that starch got turned into glucose, or in other words, digested, in that 15-minute period. And most of the time, we would just use enzymes that were derived from bacteria or fungi. And typically the bacterial and fungi enzymes are really powerful, so they will do an amazing job of breaking down starch. The fascinating thing we found is that if we used actual amylase taken from a horse's small intestine, that amylase from the horse's small intestine was able to break down significantly more starch when it was with oats than what the bacterial or fungal enzymes could do. So the horse is actually able to better digest oats than what the bacterial or fungal enzymes can. That kind of blew my mind a little bit when we were looking at that data. It wasn't true for any other grain. So for every other grain, and we were checking, corn, oats, rice, triticale. We have done others over the years. There was definitely barley in there. So we were looking at a lot of different cereal grains, and oats was the only one that the horse's enzymes were actually able to break it down more efficiently than the microbial enzymes were able to do, which sort of, it opened my eyes a little bit to the reasons why for, decades, more than 100 years, a long time, oats has been known as a safe grain for horses. And this must be part of it, is that the horses and oats just seem to get along really well, and horses seem to be able to digest the starch from oats really efficiently, and especially when compared to other cereal grains. And then the other, and this isn't our research, it was research, and I cannot remember the name of the researchers now, but there was a really cool paper that came out showing that when oat starch was allowed to reach a horse's hindgut, it also didn't cause the damaging fermentation patterns that other cereal grains will cause. So there was, and this is all off the top of my head, I should have gone and found the paper and read it again, but from memory, there was less shift in microbes towards the sugar and starch fermenting, which are the ones that we call the bad microbes. There was less shift towards them. And I think from memory, less lactic acid production. But in my mind, what I remember from that study is oat starch is less damaging when it gets to the horse's hindgut. So you've got this combination with oats that it's really digestible in the horse's small intestine, and it's not as damaging if the starch does still get through to the horse's hindgut, which makes it a really beautiful grain from that perspective, because they're able to extract that energy from the starch in the small intestine, and then it doesn't hurt them so much if it's not fully digested, and some does still end up in the hindgut. And then there's other aspects of oats that I also really love. So it's rich in beta-glucans. It's got a lot of fibre, so it does add to the fibre diversity of a horse's diet, which is something that I love about it as well. And it's quite high in oil, so it's got a nice little oil content in there as well, which adds to its energy content. And horses do seem to love oats. I think they smell really nice. I don't know if I'm weird in that I love the smell of horse feed. I remember, I must have been 16 or 17. And I went for a sleepover at my best friend's house when I was at school, and our horses on the farm when I was growing up didn't get fed any horse feed. They were on pasture. We had a beef cattle property and pastures that they lived on. And I remember going to Bronnie's house, and she fed her horses like this bran pollard mix, and she wet it. And I remember that it's such a vivid memory for me, smelling those two things mixed together and going, oh my goodness, that smells so good. So I think I was probably always destined to be a horse nutritionist because I love the smell of their food. But oats to me smells nice. And typically when you feed oats to a horse, they do find it very palatable, which, is another tick from me and gets it up here on my 5 best list. And then the fifth ingredient, there was a little bit of a tussle for who actually made the number 5 spot on this list. But I've gone with soybean, which might make some of you gasp in horror and others nod your head in agreement. But there's a very good reason why I love soybean up there. And there's also lots of qualifying features for the soybean that I have on my favourites list, because soybean is not always a good ingredient. So I'll start with why it's on the list. Soybean has got the best quality plant protein of any plant that we commonly feed to horses. So, and in fact, I'm trying to think of a plant that has high quality protein. There might be some like algal proteins and things that are high quality, but soybean has got exceptionally high quality protein. And by that, I mean it is rich in the essential amino acids, and particularly lysine and threonine, 2 of the 3 of the most limiting amino acids. It's got a decent amount of methionine, but that's probably its biggest shortfall is its methionine content, but it does an amazing job of adding particularly lysine to a horse's diet. And lysine has been known for a long time as the most limiting amino acids, and which means it's the amino acid that horses will run out of first. And if horses run out of any of those essential amino acids, essentially processes like muscle building have to stop. So I do this thing when I do live presentations where I take some of my kids. My kids have not played with building blocks for many, many years now, but they were my kids' building blocks, and they're all different colours. And I build a stack of a particular colour order. So there's lots of blue blocks in there, which I tell people they're the non-essential amino acids, and then I'll have yellow, red and green blocks. And I say that those 3 represent lysine, methionine and threonine. And I'll give about 6 people a different combination of those building blocks and ask them to replicate the stack that I have in the exact order with the exact colours. And if they get to a colour that they don't have, then they have to stop, because it brings, I guess, into real life the process of muscle building, where when a horse is trying to build muscle, they have to use a very specific combination of amino acids in a very specific order in order to build muscle, because muscle has a very defined amino acid profile. And if they get to a point where they don't have a yellow building block, which signifies lysine, the muscle building process has to stop, because the horse can't just substitute in something else. It can't go, oh, I don't have any lysine, so I'll just substitute in, I don't know, arginine and put that in the spot. It has to be lysine, and lysine is the one that we know in real life physiology is the one that animals will typically run out of, or horses will typically run out of first, and that will stop the muscle building process. So soybean is extremely valuable in a horse's diet because it has so much lysine, and it stops this halting of muscle building because the animals run out of lysine. So if you've got soybean in a horse's diet, typically the diet will be nice and rich in lysine, as well as a bunch of the other essential amino acids, and particularly threonine. So it allows me as a nutritionist to bring in that really high quality protein and to safeguard, I guess, against horses running out of essential amino acids. And, you can see visibly in a horse's diet when a horse has enough good quality protein versus not enough. And the most dramatic example of this that I've come across, and it's stuck in my mind for so many years, was lactating broodmares that were on a diet that just listed vegetable protein meal as the protein source in the feed, the fortified feed that they were being fed. So I don't actually know what that protein source was. It wasn't specified, but it was highly unlikely that it would be soybean, because often feeds that are formulated and say vegetable protein meal, they'll be least cost formulated, and soybean's one of the most expensive protein sources, so it doesn't very often end up in those rations. And you could see in these mares that they weren't getting enough quality protein. So they were on a warm season grass pasture, which doesn't have great quality protein either. I cannot remember whether they were being fed any alfalfa, but they were on this feed that listed vegetable protein, and they were doing what we call mining their own protein reserves in order to make milk for their foals. So they'd lost all of their top lines, they'd lost a lot of their muscle over their rump, because they were literally taking the protein from their own muscles to make milk for their foals. And the farm thankfully agreed to change over to a broodmare feed that contained much higher quality protein. And I did not expect these mares to rebuild their top line or to replace the muscle over their rumps until they'd weaned their foals and had a little bit of an opportunity to, rebuild their own protein reserves. But it was amazing watching these mares. We changed them onto the feed, and I saw them. I can't remember the timeline, but it wasn't that long after, say 2 or 3 months after, and they'd rebuilt their top lines and the muscle over their rump. So I'm not going to say all of the mares did. It was big. It was a whole thoroughbred breeding farm, so there was lots of horses on the farm. But by and large, most of the mares had rebuilt their muscle over their top lines, and that staggered me. I was not expecting that, and it just has really stood out to me as to how important protein quality is in a horse's diet, and particularly when they've got high protein needs. So young growing horses have got high needs for the essential amino acids. Lactating broodmares have got really high needs for the essential amino acids. Older horses or horses recovering from severe injury or disease, they all need high quality protein. And any horse that you are trying to build muscle on, so any horse that you're trying to put top line on, and if you go back and listen to the episode with Dr Nicole about back health, top line looks beautiful, and I know we all want top line because it makes our horses look beautiful. It's also very functional, and ever since doing that episode with Dr Nicole and really getting a handle on how important a horse's top line muscle is to their back health, I see horses now with weak top lines, and my first thought is not, that horse would look better if it had a better top line. My first thought is, oh, that horse's back is in some serious trouble because it doesn't have enough muscle to hold its structure together and keep it healthy. So top line is incredibly important for your horse's health, and particularly their back health. And the way that we build good quality top line and then also maintain good quality top line is from using high quality protein sources, and soybean is top of my list of high quality plant protein sources, and it does do an amazing job. We are just putting together the story of Alay, the off-the-track thoroughbred we have here for Racing Queensland's off-the-track program, and the nutrition hub that they have on their website. If anyone wants to look at information specifically about feeding off the tracks, head over there. The videos are all free to watch, and they're all up on their website now. There's some really cool resources in there, but Alay was amazing in that as soon as I put soybean into her diet, she built muscle. She was in work. She wasn't in a lot of work. She was in work, but it's amazing looking at the photos of her prior to us putting in soybean and then after, and the difference it made. So it really does work. The thing with soybean, though, is it needs to be safe to feed. It has got, in its raw form, it's got lots of anti-nutritional factors. So it's got an antitrypsin component to it, and trypsin is an enzyme, so a little pair of scissors in your horse's small intestine that is specifically tasked with cutting up and digesting protein. If you feed raw soybean, because the plant that created the soybean seed doesn't want your horse to digest that seed, So it's really clever plant physiology in that the plant actually puts in this antitrypsin factor that will stop your horse's small intestine from digesting the seed, because the seed's purpose is to travel undamaged through the horse's gut or through any animal's gut that's eaten it, and to be deposited in manure where it's got beautiful fertility and can germinate and produce the next generation of plants. So they don't want to be digested. So plants have come up with all of these clever ways of protecting their offspring, essentially, and allowing them to make it safely through an animal's gastrointestinal tract so that it can go on and reproduce for the next generation. But the problem is, if we start to feed soybean to horses, we want it digested, but if this antitrypsin factor is still active, it's essentially like the soybean tying a piece of string around your horse's trypsin enzyme and making it so that that trypsin enzyme can no longer cut up and digest protein. So the way around that is we heat treat soybean, but they have to be heat treated enough to completely deactivate the antitrypsin factor, which takes quite a lot of heat and processing. There are extruded full-fat soybeans around the world that have done a beautiful job of creating safe soybean, but you must never, ever, ever, ever feed raw soybean to horses. It will absolutely stop them from digesting protein. And the same goes for soybean hulls, but I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to the 5 ingredients that I avoid in horses' diets. But it is really important to remember soybeans do contain any nutritional factors. They contain a compound that will mess with your horse's thyroid gland function, which will also cause a lot of issues if you feed raw soybean. It also gets knocked out by the heat processing that is used to knock out the antitrypsin factor. So you have to use either a soybean meal that goes through heat treatment when the oil is extracted from it and makes it safe to feed, or if you want to use full-fat soybean, then you have to make sure that it's processed. They're not like lupins. You can't just soak them and feed them. You will cause damage. You will stop your horse from digesting protein. You'll actually push the horse in the opposite direction than what you're trying to take them by feeding soybean. So like nearly every ingredient, I love it. It has to be processed properly to be fit. That's an important one to remember. See, that's my top 5. So lucerne or alfalfa, mixed grassy hay or pasture, lupins, oats and soybean. I could, if I needed to, I could create a lot of diets for a lot of different horses just using those 5 ingredients. My preference, of course, is to use as many different ingredients as I can and to bring in even more diversity. And there are a bucket load of other ingredients that I absolutely love, but for the purposes of time, because if I sat here and talked to you about all of the ingredients I love, we'd be here forever. For the purposes of time, that's my top 5. Remember that putting them together is like a puzzle piece, and this is a large part of the reason why we build tools like the My Happy Horse Nutrition app, because it'll allow you to see, how much lucerne is too much or not enough. Do you need to add more lucerne, say, to a broodmare's diet to meet her protein or calcium requirements? Or with the, your forage base of the diet, how much do you need so that you've got your forages up in the green zone for your horse, to make sure that your horse's gut is as healthy as possible. Having been a nutritionist for 25 plus years now, it's a long time. I can do a lot of these calculations in my head, but I still love to be able to see it on a screen and go, okay, I've got the balance for this particular horse with these particular requirements. I've got the balance of my nutrients right. I'm meeting all of the requirements. Nothing's too high, nothing's too low. So if you're wondering how to put together a diet, I'd love you to go and check out the My Happy Horse Nutrition app. You can read about it. The URL is myhappy.horse. Funny URL, but that's where you'll find it. Okay, moving on to the 5 of the worst I've got scribbled down on my notes here in front of me. And top of that list, which is probably not going to come as a surprise to a lot of you who have listened to a few episodes of the podcast, is raw corn or raw maize. If it was up to me, I would eliminate this ingredient from every single horse's diet anywhere in the world because it does so much damage in their gut. So corn is a cereal grain. It's very high in starch, so 70% plus of the weight of corn is starch. And corn's a little bit like alfalfa and lucerne, corn and maize. are the same thing. So I typically tend to say corn. I know a lot of people around the world call it maize, but they're exactly the same thing. So it's a very high starch grain, and the starch is bundled up so tightly that when you feed it to a horse in its raw form, only about 30% of that starch is actually chopped up and turned into glucose and absorbed from the small intestine, which means that 70% of the starch it contains goes through and lands in the hindgut. And when it lands in the hindgut, it is rapidly fermented by the amylolytic bacteria, which are the bacteria who love to ferment starch. And they're also the bacteria we call the bad bacteria, because they ferment the starch so rapidly that they increase the production of volatile fatty acids and they start to produce lactic acid. And all of this acid starts to accumulate in your horse's hindgut, and it will lower the pH. And if the pH gets to 6.2 or lower, you'll start to kill off your good fiber fermenting bacteria, and your horse will end up in a state of microbial dysbiosis. It will have a hindgut that is full of microbes that do not serve it, so they change the gut-brain axis communication. They don't look after your horse's gastrointestinal wall, so you will start to see erosion of the hindgut wall and the acids starting to damage the hindgut wall. They are not the bacteria that are meant to be in there looking after your horse's immune function. There's so many reasons why we don't want to feed those amylolytic bacteria, and we don't want them to take over in your horse's hindgut. There's a few podcasts, if you look back, I think podcasts 9, 10 and 11 all focus on, don't quote me on those numbers, but they all focus on hindgut health. You'll see them you'll see the titles will tell you which ones to listen to. But go back and have a listen to them. They'll give you a really good sense for why microbial health is so important for your horse's health, and it'll go into more detail about why raw grains like raw corn are so damaging. But raw corn is an avoid at all costs ingredient in every horse's diet. Never ever, if you see corn in a horse's feed or maize that has not undergone heat treatment in some way, shape or form, don't put it in your horse's mouth, please. Because if I know one thing in horse nutrition, I know that it will do damage in your horse's gut. We went through, in the early 2000s, I went through about 75 racing thoroughbred stables, and the one feed ingredient I could find a relationship to in terms of hindgut health, so fecal pH and lactic acid content, and I think it was propionate as well, we looked at, was the amount of raw corn in that horse's diet. So the more corn, the less healthy the hindgut of the horse. So, and I know from my own research and from a lot of others' research around the world, it's just not digestible. It's not digestible in the small intestine, and then when it does get to the hindgut, it does so much damage. So don't feed raw corn. And by raw, I mean whole or cracked or crushed or sliced, anything that has not undergone significant heat treatment in the presence of water. So you have to have water there to make it digestible. But if it's properly extruded or properly steam flaked, properly micronized, where water is used before the grains are micronized, then it does become quite digestible, and it is an ingredient I will use sparingly, but never, ever, 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 unless it's been heat treated properly, will I put it in a horse's diet. Next on my list, and these are in no particular order now, they're ingredients that I won't use. So next on the list are two oils, so corn oil and sunflower oil. I don't use, and the reason I don't use them, they're not going to cause dramatic harm like the raw maize will, but these two oils are incredibly high in omega-6 fatty acid and contain virtually no omega-3. So particularly for horses that are on grain, have got grain in their diet, and grains are very rich in omega-6 and low in omega-3 as well, if we use corn oil or sunflower oil as a source of energy for horses and are feeding it in any significant amount, what we do is push the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio too high. And the reason that's important in very, very brief format is that plant forms of omega-6 and omega-3 are not actually the active forms of those omega fatty acids. They need to go through an elongation process to then become active in your horse's body and do all of the things that they do to maintain your horse's health. And the first stage of that activation process, both omega-6 and omega-3 share an enzyme. And omega-6 is a bit of a schoolyard bully, and if there is too much of it in your horse's diet, it'll essentially tell omega-3 to rack off. And it'll hog that pathway and it'll hog that enzyme. And so you get a lot more of the omega-6 being activated and hardly any of the omega-3 being activated. So it's really important not to try as much as possible not to unbalance your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in your horse's diet. And one of the fastest ways you will unbalance that ratio is by feeding corn or sunflower oil, because they, like I said, they're massively high in omega-6 and have a virtually non-existent amount of omega-3. So if you're wanting to use oils in your horse's diet, you're better off using something like a canola oil, which is 10% omega-3 and 20% omega-6. So it's still got more 6 than 3, but it's not the 60% omega-6 that something like sunflower oil will be. So it's still got omega-6 in there, but in a much better ratio and in a much smaller quantity than the corn or the sunflower oils. And of course, flaxseed oil is beautiful because it's mostly omega-3 and it's only got a very small amount of omega-6. And I will often use canola oil and flaxseed oil blended together for horses that need oil in the diet, but cost is a consideration because your canola oil is going to be less expensive than the flaxseed oil. And also too, horses on largely forage-based diets, I actually think they need a little bit of omega-6 sometimes added to their diet, and I do and will use canola oil in those situations. Righto, moving on. Next on my avoid is an ingredient called dolomite, and I don't know how prevalent it is still, but when I first started working as a nutritionist, there was a real push in the horse world for people to use dolomite. It was sold to them almost as a wonder mineral. It's got calcium and magnesium in it, but the problem is that the calcium and magnesium are very poorly bioavailable. So they're in the ingredient, but the horse can't actually digest them very well because of the structure of the mineral itself. An interesting little almost aside to this is that limestone mines who are mining limestone, which is calcium carbonate, out of the ground. Limestone is often found in association with dolomite. And what I learnt to do many years ago was to start making sure we tested the limestone that we're using in feed production. So, producing the bagged feeds that you will all see if you go into your feed store. Or nearly every single fortified bagged feed you can access will have either limestone or calcium carbonate, usually limestone, written on the ingredients list because it's a very cheap source and it's also a very bioavailable source of calcium for horses. So we use a lot of limestone. But what I started to realise was that sometimes what we were being sent as limestone was actually dolomite. And the way that we could determine what was to do a calcium and a magnesium analysis, and based on the analysis we could tell whether it was limestone or we could tell whether it was dolomite. And if it came in looking more like dolomite, we would reject it because it's almost pointless putting it into the ration because the horses can't digest and absorb the calcium from it, and that's why we would be using that ingredient. So if you're looking to add calcium to your horse's diet, if you mix your own diets or if you're on high oxalate, warm season or subtropical grasses somewhere in the world and need to add calcium, add it as limestone and not as dolomite. And you can also add it as your marine calciums. There's lots of different forms of calcium, but by and large your limestone is going to be your most economical. It's also very bioavailable, but do avoid dolomite because it's just not very digestible. And there's lots of minerals that fall into this category. So, when I'm using copper in formulations, I'll always go for a copper sulfate or a well-regarded organic copper because I know that they're going to be bioavailable as opposed to a copper oxide, which has got very poor bioavailability. So bioavailability does start to become very important. I can't talk about all the minerals that are available or not available for digestion, but certainly dolomite was one that was very prevalent in my early career and it's just always stuck in my mind, and it's always one that I'm really conscious of when we're formulating bagged feeds. Next on my list, I'm going to put lactic acid bacterial probiotics in here for a few reasons, and I don't have time to go into detail, and it is something that I'd love to do a whole podcast episode on, but there's a few reasons why I wouldn't use these, and this is using them. So there may be use cases for them if there's, you're trying to outcompete a pathogenic bacteria in the horse's small intestine or for disease, but I want to stay away from that part because that's more veterinary. I'm talking about a nutritional use case where probiotics are used to help to establish a healthy microbiome population in your horse's hindgut. Lactic acid bacteria are a perfectly normal part of your horse's hindgut microbial population, but research shows us that they should be 1% or less of the microbial populations in your horse's hindgut. And it's actually these bacteria that when you dump starch into a horse's hindgut, so say you were feeding corn, raw corn, and I hope if anyone is listening to this and you are feeding raw corn, that is a change you need to make today. Get that out of your horse's diet. But if you're feeding raw corn and you're dumping all of that starch into the hindgut, it's actually the lactic acid producing bacteria that you are favouring in the hindgut, and it's them building up their populations and then doing a lot of the damage that happens when you feed those populations of bacteria. We see in microbial analyses we've been doing, so Dr. Belinda Chapman, the brilliant microbiologist who's on episode 9, if anyone wants to go back and listen to that interview, some work that I've been doing with her in racehorses and also looking at a Lay's microbiome over the period of 12 months. One of the really positive changes we see is that lactic acid bacteria go from around 3% of the population in a horse's hindgut when they're being allowed, when there's some starch being allowed to enter the hindgut, falling back down to about 1%. So the concept of lactic acid bacteria as a probiotic has never made sense to me. I'm really happy to be proven wrong on this one, but so far the research also supports my thinking in that there hasn't actually been any benefit shown from a purely nutrition sense, no benefit shown of having these bacteria as probiotics in a diet. And it just doesn't make logical sense to me. Why do we want to add in the bacteria that we also work really hard to limit the populations of in the hindgut? They're on my list of ingredients that I would never use in a formulation. I would never add to my own horse's diets. I'm not saying there's no use cases for them whatsoever in the medical sphere, but do be really careful when you are interpreting, say, human probiotic information and transferring that over to horses, because our guts broad structure is similar, but the influence of microbes in our guts is very, very different. So it's got to be extremely careful extrapolating from human data across to horses, particularly in the space of lactic acid producing bacteria as probiotics. And then how many have I done? 1, 2, 3. Okay, we're up to the fourth one. So the fourth one, this is a soapbox that I get on a reasonably regular basis. My fourth ingredient is a group of feeds, I guess, and that this is the products that scream to you from the front of the packaging that a product is grain-free. And yet when you read the ingredients, there is absolutely grain-derived ingredients on that packaging. So, and unfortunately, this is quite common. I don't know in all parts of the world. It's certainly common here in Australia that you'll read something that will mislead you into thinking that that product doesn't contain any grain. You flip it over and one of the first ingredients is going to be something like wheat bran, or wheat bran's got many different names, wheat feed, brol, around the world, but it'll be something like that, some sort of grain byproduct. So if you don't go and read the ingredients and you're looking for a grain-free feed, you're ultimately potentially going to cause a lot of damage to your horse. And it's particularly frustrating for me as a nutritionist, and I know that there's veterinary farriers and a whole lot of people in the industry that get so frustrated by this that, you know, there's a lot of you as very conscientious and loving horse owners who are trying to do the best thing by, say, a laminitic pony. You go out and buy a feed that you have been told on the packaging is grain-free, and it's not. If you feed those feeds to these horses, you end up doing so much damage and causing so much pain for them, which is the bit that annoys me, is that, you know, it's the horses that lose out here. So do be really careful if you see a product that claims to be grain-free. Have a very close read of the ingredient list and confirm that that is a case. And also to all of these feeds that claim to be grain-free, they should also be providing you a starch level and a water-soluble carbohydrate level. And hopefully the label will also add those two things together for you to give you a non-structural carbohydrate level. Because if you're looking for a low non-structural carbohydrate feed ingredient for a horse or pony that is, say, insulin dysregulated and prone to laminitis or has laminitis, you have to be so, so careful in this space. So they're definitely on my list of most frustrating ingredients available to a horse, and it really is buyer beware. So just be aware that not everything you read on packaging is going to give you the full story, and you do need to learn to read feed labels. We just did a video for Racing Queensland, which if you go to the Off the Track Nutrition Hub, if you search Racing Queensland Off the Track Nutrition Hub, you'll find all of those videos, and one of them is reading a feed label. Go and watch that. I go through feeding labels in detail and talk about this in more detail. And then my last ingredient on my ingredients to avoid is one of the same ingredients that is on my favourites ingredient list. You might have guessed which one it was, and it would be soybean. So soybean in its raw form or improperly processed soybean are definitely on my avoid at all costs list, because they will do more damage than good. And this can include like actual soybean, like raw, whole or crushed soybeans that haven't undergone any heat treating, because they will still have the very active anti-nutritional factors in there, and they will make your horse sick. And I think this is why years and years ago, I remember it was an interesting day, because I had multiple feed companies contacting me saying, can you please hop on this Facebook post and put your nutritionist's view on this post, because there was a post that had gone absolutely crazy on social media about how soybean was so evil because, it had all these anti-nutritional factors and was high in phosphorus and all this other stuff that they'd pulled out as being negative aspects of soybean. And the post was absolutely correct. And also they completely missed that if you heat treat soybean in the correct way, you actually make it safe to feed. But the point is, soybean in its raw form is very damaging, and you absolutely must not feed it in your horse's diet. And I think where I see this mostly, I can't remember any time where I'd ever seen anyone actually feeding raw soybeans, like the actual seed, to their horses. But what I do see is soybean hulls that are improperly heat treated. Now, some of them are heat treated properly, and some of them I have come across a product, and I really hope it's not still on the market, but it was completely raw, had undergone no heat treatment whatsoever. There is a very simple visual test we can do on soybean. It's called Soy Check. I think you can order it if anyone is feeding soybean hulls or other soybean containing ingredients. You want to check your own ingredients, but it's literally just you drop this liquid onto the soybean, and if there's still anti-nutritional factors, if it hasn't undergone enough heat treatment, it'll light up bright pink. And I picked up these completely raw soybean hulls that the reason I found them was a stable of riding horses had asked me to come in and help them, because they were beside themselves trying to figure out what was wrong with all of their horses. Their diet looked amazing, and they had done a beautiful job of balancing up their diet. They were FedXL members back in the day. And yet their horses, their backs looked like tents. They were peaked. They had no muscle. You could see all the bony structure in their shoulders. They had no muscle over their rump. And the poor owner of these horses was tearing her hair out, thinking, what have I done so wrong? And she was feeding two different types of soybean hull. And when we tested them, one of them was okay. There was still a little bit of activity. The anti-nutritional factors right in the middle of the pellet where it hadn't gotten enough heat treatment, which is still not ideal, but it was better than the other pellet that it had no heat treatment. And when we dropped this Soy Check liquid on it, it lit up like a Christmas tree. It was bright pink. So ideally, you don't want to see any pink. Very good extruded full-fat soybean, you will see nothing. You drop the liquid on and it'll just stay its golden yellow colour. You will not see any pink, and that's what we want to see. And also well-processed soybean meal, so the soybean after the oil has been extracted. Also, you will see no pink in there. But if soybean has not been heat treated, it should never go in the mouth of a horse. So again, you need to be aware of this as a horse owner. If you're wanting to feed soybean hulls, I would be asking the companies that supply these products to, ask them if they test on a regular basis their soybean hulls, even if it is just this. You can send off to get proper lab analyses as well, but even if it is just this Soy Check colour test, it's great. It's a great way of determining whether soybean is a good ingredient or not. There are lots more ingredients that I could have on the would not feed list, but there's less that I'd put on the would not feed list than I would have on the list of my favourite ingredients, because I don't know how many favourite ingredients I have. Ryan, if you're listening to this, I know you'll be laughing at me because you know that I love my many, many multiple favourites. But yeah, so top 5 of the favourites, just as a quick recap, would be lucerne or alfalfa, your mixed grassy hazel pastures, lupins, oats and soybean, and my 5 avoid and sometimes avoid at all costs are the raw corn or maize, your high omega-6 oils like corn and sunflower oil, dolomite, because it's the minerals in it are not available to your horse, so you may as well not feed it. Lactic acid, bacterial, probiotics, grain-free feeds that are not grain-free, claim to be grain-free on their label, but when you read their ingredients, they do contain ingredients that are derived from grain, and raw soybean or improperly heat-treated soybean. So that wraps up about all I want to say today. Do just remember that nutrition is like a puzzle, and the puzzle is going to serve your horse best when it's made up of ingredients that honour your horse's ancient gastrointestinal tract. So 55 million years of evolution say that you need to feed a horse like a horse and not try to adapt them to our more modern feeding practices. And if you can do that, your horse will stay healthy and content. And honestly, they look happier when they're fed in a way that honours their gastrointestinal tract. You'll also provide the horse the nutrients your horse needs, and you will, when you put the puzzle together really well, you will avoid the ingredients that will either cause harm to the gut or don't provide nutrients your horse needs, or don't provide nutrients in a form that is available to your horse for digestion and absorption. So if you want to know more about the benefits of ingredient variety in your horse's diet, I mentioned earlier, go back and listen to episode 24, which is called Ingredient Variety and Why It Matters in Horse Nutrition. And that will take you into more depth on the many other benefits of ingredient variety in your horse's diet. And that brings us to our last new episode for the year. So thank you again for listening. Thank you so much for sharing and making us one of the most shared shows of 2025. It means a lot, and it just means that, you care enough to do the best by your horse. And I really am so grateful for that, because that's what drives me to do what I do and to love what I do so much. So it's so cool to have you on that journey with me. If you found this episode useful, I would absolutely love you to share it with someone, and especially someone you know who might be feeling overwhelmed with nutrition, which is a lot of us when it comes to nutrition, because there is so much to know and so many marketing messages and so many products on the market. So if you know anyone who is a bit overwhelmed at the moment, I'd love you to share this episode or any episode that you think might help them. And if you haven't already, please hit follow so you don't miss any of the episodes we have coming up in 2026. Until next time, come and give your horse a big scratch for me, and remember to keep feeding them like a horse. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.